You think you're listening to the joyous birth of rock and roll? You're wrong. You are listening to a hostage situation. The 1950s white establishment didn't just steal a rhythm, they executed the grandest cultural heist of the 20th century. They took a queer black man's primal scream of trauma, forced him into the humiliating armor of a sexless clown, and tricked a segregated nation into dancing to his psychological crucifixion. We don't start this story with a gold record playing in a safe suburban living room. We start in the terrifying, violent heat of the Jim Crow South. Because this isn't a story about musical innovation, it is a story about the brutal price of survival. His name was Little Richard. And we must ask, why did the true sovereign of a global empire have to violently strip away his own manhood just to stay alive and sing his own song? The issue is not simply where Richard Wayne Penniman was born. The issue is the specific suffocating architecture of the world he was born into. The magnitude of his rebellion only makes sense when you grasp the absolute rigidity of the prison. Post-World War II, America projected an image of flawless, manicured prosperity to the globe. It was the era of the nuclear family, the picket fence, and the unspoken ironclad laws of racial and social segregation. But beneath this veneer of polite suburban tranquility, particularly in the deep American South, existed a caste system as violent and uncompromising as any in human history. Macon, Georgia, in the 1930s and 40s, was a territory defined by lines that could not be crossed without lethal consequences. There were white neighborhoods and black neighborhoods, white fountains and black fountains, white realities and black realities. If you were a black man in the Jim Crow South, the primary directive of your existence was to remain invisible. You survived by shrinking, by speaking softly, by making yourself small so as not to agitate the white establishment. But Richard Penniman did not know how to shrink. From his earliest breaths, he was a volatile contradiction. He was born into a deeply religious family, yet his father, Charles Penniman, was a brick mason who secretly sold bootleg liquor and ran a nightclub, existing simultaneously as a strict church deacon and a denizen of the underworld. This dual reality, the sacred and the profane operating under the same roof, forged the psychological foundation of everything Richard would later become. However, the tragedy of Richard's youth was rooted in an intimate rejection. He was the third of 12 children, but he was different. He was flamboyant, highly emotional, and possessed a natural, uncontainable effeminacy that enraged his father. In a society where a black man's physical strength and stoicism were his only tools for labor and survival, a soft, eccentric son was viewed not just as a disappointment, but as a dangerous liability. Charles Penniman famously declared that he had wanted 7 boys, and Richard had ruined it. The psychological wound inflicted by this paternal rejection was profound and permanent. Driven from his own home as a teenager for his undeniable homosexuality and flamboyant demeanor, Richard was thrust into a world that wanted to crush him. Yet he possessed a weapon. It was a voice that did not merely sing, it detonated. The genesis of that voice was not found in a conservatory, but in the frantic, spirit-filled walls of the Pentecostal church. The sanctified churches of the Black South were the only spaces where emotional restraint was not required. Here, worship was visceral. It was sweating, crying, stomping, and speaking in tongues. It was a total physical release of the trauma of the week. Richard absorbed this primal energy. He learned how to push his vocal cords to the absolute limit, delivering a harsh, raspy scream that could cut through the noise of a fervid congregation. He wasn't just learning to hit notes, he was learning how to command a room through sheer sonic force. When gospel legend sister Rosetta Tharpe heard a young Richard singing her songs before a concert at the Macon City Auditorium, she pulled him on stage. Paying him out of her own pocket, she validated the very essence that his father had despised. It was the moment the outcast realized his difference was not a curse, but a currency. Exiled from his family, Richard plunged headfirst into the Chitling circuit, the sprawling underground network of black-owned nightclubs, juke joints, and theaters that stretched across the segregated states. This was a brutal, exhausting, and dangerous proving ground. These venues were not polite concert halls. They were hot, overcrowded rooms smelling of cheap liquor and sweat, often fraught with violence, where performers had to compete with the audience just to be heard. To survive the Chitlin circuit, an artist had to be electrifying. You had to grab the audience by the throat within the first 10 seconds, or you would be ignored, or worse, attacked. Here, Richard began to synthesize his identity. He observed performers like Billy Wright, a flamboyant blues singer known as the Prince of the Blues, who wore heavy makeup and processed hair. He crossed paths with a mysterious, towering piano player named Escarita, who pounded the keys with manic aggression and wore his hair in a gravity-defying pompadour. Richard took these elements, the gospel scream, the blues rhythm, the visual extravagance, and amplified them to an unprecedented extreme. He was no longer just singing, he was performing an exorcism on stage. For years, however, the recording industry did not know what to do with him. He signed with RCA Victor and then Peacock Records, but the executives tried to force him into a conventional, subdued rhythm and blues mold. They wanted him to sound like a standard crooner, a safe imitation of artists who were already successful. The recordings were flat, lifeless, and commercially disastrous. Richard was starving, washing dishes in a Greyhound bus station back in Macon just to survive, sending desperate demo tapes to anyone who would listen. He was a contained explosion, waiting for the right fuse. And this is where the plot twists into history. In 1955, Art Roop of Specialty Records, searching for a gritty voice to rival the success of Ray Charles, heard Richard's raw demo. He sent his A&R man, Robert Bumps Blackwell, to New Orleans to record this unknown singer at Cosimo Matassa's legendary J&M studio. The session was entirely unremarkable at first. Blackwell, much like the previous producers, kept trying to make Richard sing slow, conventional blues. The takes were uninspired. Richard felt constrained, unable to unleash the feral energy that defined his live shows. Frustrated and exhausted, they called for a lunch break and walked down the street to a local black sanctuary, the Dewdrop Inn. There, a battered, upright piano sat in the corner. Richard, irritated by the morning's failure, sat down and decided to show Blackwell what he actually did when no one was trying to control him. He hammered the keys with a frantic, punishing rhythm and launched into a song he had been performing in the clubs for years. It was a filthy, sexually explicit chant, driven by an unyielding beat and punctuated by a nonsensical rhythmic scream. The lyrics were undeniably obscene, detailing acts that would have seen them arrested if broadcast on public radio. But the sheer velocity of the performance, the unhinged joy and the aggressive power of the delivery hit Bumps Blackwell like a physical blow. He realized instantly that they had been trying to record the wrong man. They didn't need a blues crooner. They needed this hurricane. Knowing the original lyrics could never be recorded, Blackwell hastily brought in a local songwriter, Dorothy Labostri to scrub the filth from the song. She sat in the studio furiously rewriting the words into a socially acceptable, albeit nonsensical narrative about a girl named Sue. With only minutes left of the studio time, Richard stepped back up to the microphone. What happened next was the capturing of a cultural lightning strike. The track they recorded was Tutti Frutti. When you listen to the original master of Tutti Frutti, you are not just hearing a song. You are hearing the precise moment a new world order was violently established. The drum beat is a relentless, propulsive assault. The piano playing is not melodic. It is percussive, almost violent. And then there is Richard's voice. He does not ease into the melody. He kicks the door off its hinges. His opening scream, a wop bop, a loo bop, a lop bom bom, was a declaration of war against the polite, restrained sensibilities of the 1950s. It was the sound of complete, unashamed liberation. It was fierce. It was black. It was undeniably queer in its chaotic energy, and it was entirely unstoppable. When the record was released in late 1955, it did not just climb the rhythm and blues charts, it detonated across the cultural landscape. The impact was seismic. For the first time, a massive number of white teenagers were turning their radio dials away from the bland, orchestrated pop of their parents and tuning in to the late-night black radio stations. They heard Tutti Frutti, and they reacted with an unprecedented fervor. The music possessed a physical imperative. It commanded movement. It bypassed the intellect and went straight to the nervous system. White youth across America were mesmerized by this wild, uninhibited sound. They bought the record, they danced to it with a frenzied energy, and they began to idolize the man who created it. But this massive cross-cultural appeal is exactly where the establishment realized they had a problem they could not simply ignore. The issue was not merely that white teenagers were listening to loud music. The issue was that they were passionately engaging with black culture, and worse, they were doing it through a medium that was fundamentally erotic and rebellious. To the white, conservative power structure of the 1950s, rock and roll was not a genre, it was a symptom of societal decay. It was perceived as a direct threat to the segregated status quo. The fear was palpable and deeply ingrained. If white youth were dancing to black music, integrating in concert halls, and worshiping a black idol, the psychological walls of Jim Crow would begin to crumble. The backlash was swift, organized, and draconian. City councils and religious leaders across the country mobilized against this invisible enemy. White citizens' councils in the South issued frantic newsletters declaring rock and roll to be part of a malicious plot to undermine the moral fabric of white youth and promote miscegenation. They labeled it jungle music, a deeply racist dog whistle designed to invoke fear of primitive savagery. The language used was apocalyptic. They argued that the heavy, syncopated drum beats were designed to break down emotional resistance and trigger base animalistic urges. It was a political panic disguised as a moral crusade. The primary weapon of this counterattack was censorship. Radio stations serving the mainstream white demographic instituted strict, unforgiving bans on Little Richard's music. Station managers instructed their disc jockeys to physically destroy his records, sometimes smashing them on air as a performative act of moral cleansing. They refused to broadcast the primal scream of Tutti Frutti, arguing that the vocal delivery was too raw, too unrefined, and inherently dangerous. They claimed they were protecting the public airways from obscenity, but the reality was far more insidious. They were attempting to quarantine a cultural revolution. They were trying to silence a black man whose power had grown too vast, whose influence had breached the heavily guarded borders of white suburbia. Yet the irony of the situation was inescapable. The establishment could ban the man, but they could not extinguish the demand for the sound he had created. The teenagers had tasted the adrenaline, and the bland pop music of the past was no longer sufficient. The record companies, viewing this not as a moral crisis but as an unprecedented economic opportunity, faced a complex dilemma. They saw the millions of dollars waiting to be harvested from the rock and roll craze, but they were blocked by the systemic racism of the radio networks and the undeniable hostility of the adult demographic. They needed the rhythm, they needed the energy, but they absolutely could not sell the black architect who built it. The raw, unapologetic brilliance of Little Richard was simply too much for the system to digest. Therefore, a solution had to be manufactured. If the original artifact was deemed too hazardous, too politically explosive to be consumed by the mainstream, the industry would simply construct a counterfeit. They would extract the DNA of the music, strip away its soul, its danger, and its blackness, and package it in a vessel that the white establishment could swallow without choking. This was not a matter of artistic interpretation or homage. It was a calculated industrial strategy of cultural extraction. The foundation of rock and roll had been laid in blood, sweat, and the oppressive heat of the Jim Crow South, but the millions of dollars it generated were about to be diverted into entirely different pockets. The music was about to be kidnapped, and the true king, having just forced the world to listen to his voice, was about to witness the most audacious and lucrative heist in the history of modern entertainment. Grasping the mechanics of the grandest cultural heist of the 20th century requires us to first dismantle a modern misconception. In today's musical landscape, when an artist records a cover of another musician's song, it is generally perceived as an act of homage, a tribute to the original creator. But in the rigidly segregated, fiercely capitalist recording industry of the mid-1950s, a cover record was not a tribute. It was a hostile corporate takeover. It was a legally sanctioned assassination of the original black artist's commercial viability. The recording industry was faced with a highly lucrative dilemma. The white teenage demographic had proven they had a ravenous, almost uncontrollable appetite for the driving, syncopated rhythms of rock and roll. However, the gatekeepers of society, the radio station managers, the television executives, and the conservative parents refused to allow the black architects of this music into their living rooms. The raw, unfiltered blackness of artists like Little Richard was deemed too politically volatile, too sexually threatening, and too radically liberating to be broadcast over the mainstream airwaves. The industry's solution to this problem was not to challenge the racism of the establishment, but to monetize it. They realized that if they could surgically extract the infectious rhythm from the original recording, scrub away the ethnic identity of the creator, and pasteurize the vocal delivery, they could sell the exact same product to white America without triggering a moral panic. They needed the heat of the fire, but they flatly refused to acknowledge the man who struck the match. The epicenter of this highly profitable sanitization process was Dot Records, an independent label founded by a shrewd businessman named Randy Wood in Gallatin, Tennessee. Wood was not a musical visionary. He was an economic pragmatist. He understood the complex racial anxieties of the white suburbs better than anyone. He recognized that millions of white teenagers were currently listening to black radio stations late at night, hiding under their bed covers, to hear the forbidden sounds of Little Richard's Tutti Frutti. Wood's business model was brilliantly cynical. He would simply monitor the rhythm and blues charts, identify the tracks that were generating the most subterranean heat, and immediately rush a white, profoundly unthreatening singer into the studio to record an exact note-for-note copy of the song. By leveraging superior distribution networks and the inherent racial bias of the powerful pop radio stations, Wood could guarantee that his sanitized, whitewashed version would hit the mainstream airwaves weeks before the original black artist even had a chance to cross over. It was a factory specifically designed for cultural extraction, and it required a very specific type of human instrument to function. Wood did not need a singer with soul or grit or lived experience. He needed a blank canvas. He needed a Trojan horse. He found the absolute perfect specimen in a young, clean-cut, fiercely religious university student named Pat Boone. To look at Pat Boone in 1956 was to look at the meticulously constructed ideal of white Christian American adolescence. He was a direct descendant of the pioneer Daniel Boone. He wore pristine white buck shoes, neatly pressed V-neck sweater vests, and sported a haircut so perfectly contoured it looked as though it could withstand a hurricane. He was a devoted family man who famously refused to kiss his co-stars in movies because of his strict moral convictions. His voice was a gentle, soothing, perfectly pitched baritone that had been trained in church choirs and university glee clubs. He was the absolute, undeniable antithesis of everything Little Richard represented. If Little Richard was a howling tempest of repressed trauma and manic queer energy, Pat Boone was a glass of warm, pasteurized milk. Boone did not even particularly like rock and roll. His personal taste leaned heavily towards the gentle crooning of Bing Crosby and Perry Como. Yet, this total detachment from the emotional core of the music made him the ideal operative for the industry's mission. He could sing the notes without feeling the rhythm. He could recite the lyrics without vibrating with the desperate ecstasy that birthed them. When Dot Records selected Tutti Frutti for the sanitization treatment, the recording session was a masterclass in musical castration. You must play the prosecuting attorney in your own mind and analyze the auditory evidence. When Little Richard sang the opening line, it was a sudden, violent explosion, a scream that tore from the bottom of his diaphragm, signaling a total rejection of musical propriety. When Pat Boone stepped up to the microphone to record the exact same line, the result was almost comical in its sterility. Boone did not scream. He politely enunciated. He sang a wop-bop, a loo-bop with the careful, measured cadence of a substitute teacher reading a nursery rhyme to a kindergarten class. The furious, punishing piano boogie that Richard had hammered out with his fists was replaced by a stiff, mathematically correct studio band that completely failed to capture the chaotic swing of the New Orleans rhythm section. Every ounce of danger, every drop of sweat, every hint of sexual menace was surgically removed from the track. The lyrics, already heavily censored from Richard's original club version, sounded utterly absurd, coming from Boone's smiling, earnest mouth. It was a riot translated into elevator music. It was a wild, untamed beast that had been caught, sedated, and stuffed for display in a suburban living room. Yet, the devastating tragedy of this situation is that the calculated mediocrity of Pat Boone's version was exactly what made it an unstoppable commercial juggernaut. The issue wasn't that Boone was a superior artist. The issue was that the systemic racism of the American broadcasting network was waiting with open arms for a white man to deliver this rhythm. The very same radio disc jockeys who had vehemently denounced Little Richard's music as primitive jungle rhythm and physically smashed his vinyl records on the air, immediately championed Pat Boone as a wholesome teenage idol. They placed Boone's tepid cover of Tutti Frutti on heavy rotation. Television executives who were terrified of broadcasting Little Richard's flamboyant, unpredictable, and inherently threatening physical performance gladly invited Pat Boone onto their national variety shows. The visual contrast was jarring and deeply unjust. While Little Richard was tearing off his clothes standing on top of his piano and dripping with sweat in the dangerous, overcrowded venues of the Chitlin circuit, Pat Boone was standing rigidly in front of television cameras, snapping his fingers awkwardly, smiling his toothpaste commercial smile, and safely delivering the stolen goods to millions of white households. The financial discrepancy that followed this cultural theft was nothing short of staggering, and it highlights the brutal economic reality of the music business. Pat Boone's cover of Tutti Frutti rocketed up the mainstream pop charts, completely eclipsing Little Richard's original version in almost every major white market. Boone's version sold well over 1 million copies, transforming him into an overnight millionaire, a cinematic leading man, and a household name. He became the gold standard for the recording industry's strategy of appropriation, going on to build a massive fortune by systematically covering and diluting the hits of other black artists like Fats Domino and the El Dorados. Meanwhile, Little Richard was trapped in a financial nightmare, desperate to escape poverty and get his foot in the door of the industry. He had signed a heavily exploitative contract with Specialty Records, effectively signing away the lion's share of his publishing rights. He received a mere half-cent per record sold. So while Pat Boone and the executives at Dot Records were purchasing mansions and building generational wealth from the explosive popularity of Tutti Frutti, the man who actually conceived the song, who pulled it from the depths of his own soul and suffered through the grueling indignities of the Jim Crow South to create it, was receiving absolute pennies. But the theft went far beyond mere economics. To view this solely as a financial crime is to fundamentally misunderstand the depth of the wound inflicted on the artist. Little Richard was forced to watch in real time as his identity and his historical footprint were erased and rewritten. He was acutely aware of his own genius. He knew that what he had created in that New Orleans studio was revolutionary. He had forged a new language, a new way for human beings to physically interact with sound. Yet the establishment was treating him not as a sovereign creator, but as a rough draft. He was merely the raw material, the R&D department for the white recording industry. They took his blood, his sweat, and his trauma, polished it until it was unrecognizable, and handed the crown to a man who had never suffered a day in his life. For an artist of Richard's immense pride and undeniable ego, this was a psychological crucifixion. He realized that the system was rigged with such profound structural prejudice that sheer talent and groundbreaking innovation were completely insufficient. If he wrote a masterpiece, the white establishment would simply steal it, give it to a white face, and ban him from his own kingdom. This realization birthed a desperate, gnawing anxiety within him. He was a king without a country, watching imposters wear his stolen jewels. He knew that Randy Wood and the machinery of Dot Records were waiting in the shadows. Every time he entered the studio, he knew that the moment he produced another hit, Pat Boone or someone exactly like him would be rushed into a vocal booth to record the counterfeit. He was trapped in a Sisyphean nightmare, constantly creating brilliant, world-altering music, only to watch it be immediately hijacked by the sanitization machine. He could not fight them in the courts because the legal system of the 1950s offered almost no protection for black artists regarding the mechanical reproduction of their songs. He could not fight them on the radio because the white station managers held absolute dictatorial control over the airwaves. And he certainly could not fight them with physical anger because for a black man in the Jim Crow South, expressing public rage toward the white establishment was an immediate invitation to a lynching. He was entirely cornered. The conventional avenues of artistic defense were sealed shut. If he continued to write standard rock and roll songs, the industry would continue to feed off him like a parasite, growing incredibly wealthy while keeping him marginalized and censored. Therefore, Richard was forced to analyze the specific mechanics of the theft. Why was Pat Boone able to steal Tutti Frutti? Because despite its wild rhythm, the vocal melody was relatively straightforward, and the tempo could be easily slowed down and regularized by a studio band. The song, in its recorded structure, was reproducible. The problem wasn't just the system, the problem was that his music was still too easy to copy. This is where the genius of Little Richard pivoted from pure musical intuition into calculated defensive warfare. He realized that to stop the theft, he had to make the product fundamentally unstealable. He had to create a sound so ferociously idiosyncratic, so relentlessly fast, and so intimately tied to his own unique vocal cord anomalies that no clean-cut white pop singer could possibly replicate it without sounding entirely ridiculous. He returned to the studio with Bumps Blackwell, fueled not just by creative fire, but by a profound prosecuting anger. He dictated that the tempo of the backing band be pushed to an almost impossible speed. He instructed the drummers to hit harder, the saxophones to wail louder, and he pushed his own voice into a stratosphere of manic, screaming intensity that bordered on the chaotic. He was no longer just singing. He was building an auditory fortress around his intellectual property. When he recorded Long Tall Sally, it was a deliberate, strategic counterattack against Pat Boone and the entire Dot Records empire. The song was a breathless, rapid-fire assault. The lyrics were delivered at a breakneck speed, blurring together in a frantic, syncopated rhythm that required the lung capacity of an athlete and the rhythmic timing of a jazz percussionist. He packed the song with his trademark falsetto screams, not as musical accents, but as booby traps. He famously told his producer that he was going to sing it so fast and so high that Pat Boone would trip over his own tongue trying to keep up. It was a brilliant, spiteful, and entirely necessary evolution of his art. And mathematically, the strategy worked. While Pat Boone predictably attempted to cover Long Tall Sally, his version was a catastrophic artistic failure. Boone simply could not navigate the sheer velocity and rhythmic complexity of Richard's delivery. The whitewashed cover sounded clumsy, breathless, and utterly devoid of groove, proving once and for all that the magic of rock and roll was inextricably linked to the specific black genius of its creator. For the first time, Little Richard's original version outsold the Pat Boone counterfeit, finally securing his rightful place at the top of the charts. But the victory was intensely precarious, and it came with a terrifying realization. He had successfully outrun the thieves by pushing his music to the absolute limit of sonic aggression. He had proved that his artistic DNA could not be easily cloned. However, by amplifying his wildness, his speed, and his unapologetic black power to protect his music, he had simultaneously amplified the very things that terrified the white establishment in the first place. He had stopped Pat Boone, but he had exponentially increased his own visibility as a cultural threat. The faster and louder he sang, the more frenzied his mixed-race audiences became, and the more the white, conservative power structure viewed him as a clear and present danger to the social order. He was no longer just an entertainer whose songs were being stolen. He was a revolutionary leader inciting a youth rebellion every time he stepped onto a stage. The issue now was no longer about copyright or record sales. The issue had escalated into a matter of physical survival. As his fame exploded, he was thrust out of the relatively insulated world of the underground Chitlin circuit and forced to tour across the deeply segregated, violently racist landscape of mainstream America. He was a black man commanding the attention, the adoration, and the physical bodies of white teenagers in auditoriums located deep within the heart of Ku Klux Klan territory. He was walking a tightrope over a blazing inferno, and the safety net had been completely removed. The theft of his music had forced him to become louder to survive musically, but that very loudness was about to put a literal target on his back, and this necessitated a sacrifice so humiliating, a strategy so deeply traumatizing, that the psychological scars would dictate the rest of his natural life. The true, terrifying cost of the crown becomes clear only when we follow Little Richard out of the recording studio and into the physical reality of the American highway in the late 1950s. The issue was no longer confined to the grooves of a vinyl record or the sanitized theft perpetrated by Dot Records. The music had escaped. It was in the bloodstream of the nation, and the architect of this infectious, rebellious rhythm was now required to present his physical body to the masses. When Little Richard's tour bus crossed the Mason-Dixon line, descending into the deep, segregated South, he was not entering a territory of adoring fans. He was entering a combat zone. You must visualize the architecture of a live concert in the Jim Crow era. These were not the unified, euphoric stadium crowds of the modern age. These auditoriums were rigorously, legally divided. A thick physical rope was literally tied down the center aisle of the dance floor. On one side stood the black youth, the originators and natural inheritors of the rhythm. On the other side stood the white youth, drawn magnetically to a sound they had been explicitly told was dangerous, primitive, and forbidden. Surrounding this fragile, combustible arrangement was a heavy perimeter of white, heavily armed police officers, their batons drawn, their faces set in expressions of rigid hostility. They were not there to protect the entertainer. They were there to enforce the boundaries of the racial caste system. When Little Richard struck the piano and released that first ungodly scream, the physical reaction of the crowd was instantaneous and uncontrollable. The driving, syncopated rhythm of rock and roll was completely incompatible with standing still. It demanded a visceral, bodily response. Within minutes, the sheer kinetic force of the music would invariably cause the crowd to surge forward. The physical rope separating the segregated halves of the auditorium would snap under the pressure of hundreds of dancing bodies. White teenagers and black teenagers, caught in the communal ecstasy of the rhythm, would begin to dance together. In the deeply conservative, hyper-segregated environment of the 1950s South, this was not merely a breach of etiquette. It was viewed as a catastrophic breakdown of civilizational order. To the white authorities observing from the perimeter, This integration on the dance floor was the realization of their darkest, most paranoid political nightmares. They saw their children being hypnotized and seduced by a black man commanding the stage. The police would routinely charge into the crowds, swinging their nightsticks, cracking heads, and violently attempting to force the teenagers back into their socially mandated compartments. Concerts frequently ended in riots, tear gas, and mass arrests. At the absolute center of this swirling, violent vortex stood Little Richard. He was acutely, terrifyingly aware of the precariousness of his position. He was a black man holding absolute power over a room full of white women who were screaming his name, tearing at their clothes, and weeping with hysterical devotion. We must confront the specific, lethal pathology of white male anxiety in this era to understand the gravity of his situation. The defining, unspoken terror of the Jim Crow South was the deeply ingrained, irrational fear of black male sexuality. The societal mythology painted black men as inherent predators, and any display of power, magnetism, or physical attractiveness by a black man in the presence of white women was immediately criminalized. This was not an abstract sociological concept. It was a bleeding, immediate reality. In 1955, the very same year Little Richard recorded Tutti, Frutti, a 14-year-old black boy named Emmett Till was abducted, brutally tortured, and murdered in Mississippi simply for allegedly whistling at a white woman. His mutilated face, displayed in an open casket, was burned into the collective consciousness of every black person in America. The message was unequivocal. If you look at them, if you attract them, if you challenge the sexual hierarchy of the white establishment, you will be annihilated. Now place Little Richard on a brightly lit stage in Georgia or Alabama. He was young, he was objectively handsome, he possessed a muscular, sweating physique, and he radiated a raw, electric charisma that was entirely unprecedented. He was everything the white establishment feared, magnified by 1,000 watts of amplification. He knew with absolute certainty that if he stood on that stage and projected the natural, potent masculinity of a traditional rhythm and blues shouter, he would not survive the tour. If the white fathers, the police chiefs, and the members of the Ku Klux Klan, lingering in the shadows of the balcony, perceived him as a genuine, virile man capable of seducing their daughters, they would simply pull him off the stage and hang him from the nearest tree. His fatal weakness, the psychological vulnerability that dictated his every move, was a crushing, overwhelming terror. He was fiercely ambitious. He knew his music was revolutionary. But above all else, he possessed a desperate, primal instinct to stay alive. He wanted to claim his kingdom, but he did not want to die for it. Faced with this impossible, lethal equation, Little Richard engineered one of the most tragic, brilliant, and deeply humiliating survival strategies in the history of modern performance. He realized that he could not fight the systemic violence of the establishment with physical force or legal appeals. He had to manipulate their psychology. He had to short-circuit their racial and sexual paranoia through an act of extreme calculated misdirection. If his masculinity was the very thing that made him a target, then the only logical solution was to completely obliterate it. He had to publicly, visibly, and aggressively emasculate himself. This is the genesis of the clown armor. The flamboyant, eccentric persona that the world associated with Little Richard was not a spontaneous expression of artistic freedom. It was a meticulously constructed shield forged in the fires of racial terror. He began to apply Pancake 31 makeup, spreading it thickly over his face to pale his complexion and mask his natural features. He drew heavy, exaggerated lines of black eyeliner around his eyes, extending them into theatrical, almost grotesque feline swoops. He applied bright, garish rouge to his cheeks and painted his lips. He grew his hair out and had it chemically processed, teased, and sprayed into a towering 6-inch pompadour that defied gravity and conventional male grooming. He abandoned the sharp, tailored suits of his peers and began draping himself in oversized flowing capes covered in mirrored sequins, wearing shirts with ruffled collars, and adorning his fingers with massive, ostentatious costume jewelry. But the visual transformation was only the first layer of the defense mechanism. The truly crucial element was his physical behavior, his manipulation of the queer survival tactic. When he stepped onto the stage, he did not just play the piano. He executed a pantomime of extreme, almost hysterical effeminacy. He rolled his eyes theatrically, he shrieked, he giggled, he fluttered his hands in exaggerated, limp-wristed gestures. He adopted a high-pitched, campy speaking voice between songs, deliberately utilizing the slang and cadence of the underground drag balls. He weaponized his own degradation, broadcasting a desperate, silent plea encoded in sequins and grease paint. He projected an image of total sexual harmlessness, a painted freak, a campy curiosity, assuring the hostile white establishment that he was entirely exempt from their definition of manhood. By actively presenting himself as a joke rather than a man, he ensured he was entirely incapable of threatening their women or their social order. The tragedy is that this strategy worked with devastating efficiency. When the white police officers and the hostile segregationists looked at the stage, they did not see a powerful, magnetic black man leading a cultural revolution. They saw a clown. They saw a bizarre, painted jester who was so absurd, so utterly devoid of traditional masculine threat, that they could not bring themselves to feel endangered by him. The tension in the room would inexplicably shift. The white men would begin to laugh. They would point at him, mock him, and derive a sense of comfortable superiority from his perceived degradation. By forcing them to view him as a laughable grotesquerie, he entirely neutralized their murderous intent. He essentially granted them permission to enjoy the relentless, driving power of his music, because he had successfully convinced them that the vessel delivering the music was pathetic and benign. He had found a loophole in the architecture of Jim Crow. They would not lynch a man they were busy laughing at. Yet, we must deeply examine the catastrophic psychological toll of this compromise. Survival is not the same as victory, and the price little Richard paid for his physical safety was the systematic butchering of his own dignity. Every time he sat before a mirror in a cramped, humid dressing room and began to trowel the heavy makeup onto his face, he was actively burying his own pride. He was a musical genius, the sole architect of a sound that was actively reshaping the global cultural landscape. But in order to deliver that sound, he had to dress up like a caricature of a human being. He was a sovereign king who was forced by the threat of violence to wear the bells and motley of a court jester in his own palace. The inner dissonance was tearing him apart. He possessed a massive ego, a deep well of self-respect, and a profound understanding of his own historical importance. He knew that the music he was playing was serious, complex, and vital, but the world was treating him like a novelty act. He was acutely aware of the bitter irony that while he was forced to hide behind a mask of campy absurdity to avoid being murdered, the white artists who were busy stealing his music, the Pat Boones and the Elvis Presleys, were allowed to perform in their own skin. Elvis Presley could stand on a national television stage, sneer, thrust his hips, and project raw, dangerous sexuality, and he was rewarded with millions of dollars and global adoration. Presley was celebrated for the exact same physical magnetism that would have gotten Little Richard killed. Presley could be a sex symbol. Richard had to be a sexless alien. This glaring double standard created a reservoir of deep, unresolved rage within him. He was trapped in a prison of his own brilliant design. The clown armor had saved his life. It had allowed him to break through the racial barriers of the radio and the touring circuits, but it had also permanently fused to his skin. The public, the media, and the record industry refused to see past the makeup. They consumed the product of his genius, but denied him the respect afforded to a serious artist. They loved the rhythm, but they demanded that the creator remain a joke. He was invited into the living rooms of white America, but only on the strict condition that he checked his manhood at the door. He was allowed to entertain them, but he was never, ever allowed to challenge them. As the 1950s drew to a close, the pressure of maintaining this excruciating duality became unbearable. The grueling, relentless touring schedule, combined with the constant fear of racial violence and the psychological exhaustion of living inside a caricature, pushed him to the absolute brink of a breakdown. He was relying heavily on alcohol and amphetamines just to summon the manic energy required to perform his nightly exorcisms. He was wealthy, he was famous, but his soul was slowly suffocating beneath the layers of Pancake 31. He looked out at the crowds of screaming teenagers and realized that he had given them the soundtrack to their liberation, but he was still a hostage. He had built the highway, but he was forced to drive on it in the trunk of the car. The conflict between the profound majesty of his creation and the profound humiliation of his existence was unsustainable. The architect was preparing to abandon the building. He was about to look at the massive, lucrative empire of rock and roll he had built with his bare hands and walk completely away from it, seeking refuge in the only place that had ever offered him a semblance of peace before the noise began. The year was 1957, and the breaking point arrived not in the segregated American South, but on a concert stage in Sydney, Australia. Little Richard was at the absolute zenith of his commercial power. He had sold tens of millions of records, his face was plastered across international magazines, and he was commanding fees that were previously unimaginable for a black entertainer. Yet internally, he was a man standing on the edge of a psychological precipice. The grueling schedule of one-night stands, the heavy reliance on narcotics to fuel his manic stage persona, and the suffocating daily humiliation of wearing the clown armor had fractured his spirit. He was profoundly exhausted by the act of survival, but the catalyst for his ultimate rebellion came from the sky. During a massive outdoor concert performing to a frenzied crowd of thousands, Richard looked up and saw a brilliant fiery streak tear across the night sky. It was October 4th, 1957. The Soviet Union had just launched Sputnik 1, and the rocket booster was burning up in the atmosphere. But Richard, deeply entrenched in his Pentecostal upbringing and psychologically fragile, did not see the dawn of the space age. He saw the end of the world. He saw the biblical apocalypse his father and the church elders had warned him about. He saw the fiery finger of God pointing directly at a painted, compromised man singing the devil's music. The reaction was immediate and absolute. In the middle of the tour, at the height of his fame, Little Richard walked away from the piano. He abruptly canceled the remaining dates, sacrificing thousands of dollars in guaranteed income. and boarded a ferry crossing the Hunter River. In a deeply symbolic, desperate act of purification, he took his massive, diamond-encrusted rings, the very symbols of his hard-won wealth, his garish persona, and his sinful empire, and threw them into the dark water. He publicly renounced rock and roll. He declared to the bewildered press that he was giving his life back to God, that the music he had created was evil, and that he was leaving the industry forever to study theology and become a minister. To the outside world, this looked like the erratic behavior of a madman. But if you analyze the evidence, it was an act of profound self-preservation. He was not just fleeing from sin, he was fleeing from the unbearable weight of his own creation. He had looked at the monster of the music industry, a machine that stole his genius, mocked his humanity, and forced him to play the emasculated fool. And he chose exile over continued participation. He chose poverty and obscurity over a crown made of thorns. This self-imposed exile, stretching into the early 1960s, created a massive silent vacuum at the center of the cultural landscape. But the industry did not mourn his departure. They capitalized on it. With the architect out of the way, the scavengers descended to strip the palace of its remaining gold. This era witnessed the complete, unhindered acceleration of the cultural theft. Without the volatile, unpredictable presence of Little Richard to remind the public of the music's true dangerous origins, the recording industry aggressively sanitized the narrative. They elevated Elvis Presley, who had recently returned from his military service, not as a dangerous rebel, but as a safe, patriotic movie star. They continued to pump out sanitized teen idols like Frankie Avalon and Fabian, young white men who possessed none of the grit, none of the trauma, and none of the rhythm of the originators, but who were perfectly suited for the rigid, conservative demands of television. The music that had been born in the sweaty, dangerous juke joints of the Jim Crow South was now being manufactured in corporate boardrooms in New York and Los Angeles. It was a total, comprehensive whitewashing of history. The rebellion had been successfully commodified, and while the white artists bought mansions and built generational dynasties, the man who had laid the foundation was sitting in a small, unheated classroom in a theological seminary in Alabama, preaching the gospel to tiny congregations for a few dollars a week. However, the sheer kinetic force of Little Richard's original recordings could not be entirely contained by the American industry's attempt at historical erasure. While the United States was busy burying his legacy beneath a mountain of polite pop music, his records had crossed the Atlantic Ocean and landed like unexploded ordnance in the depressed working-class industrial cities of the United Kingdom. We must look to a seaport town called Liverpool to find the true inheritors of the kingdom. A generation of young, disaffected British teenagers were listening to imported American rhythm and blues records with an obsessive scholarly devotion. They were not listening to Pat Boone. They were listening to the raw, unadulterated screams of Little Richard. For these young men escaping the bleak reality of post-war Britain, Richard was not a clown. He was a deity. He was the embodiment of ultimate freedom. When Little Richard, financially destitute from his years in the ministry and pressured by a shifting cultural tide, finally agreed to mount a European comeback tour in 1962, the reality of his influence was laid bare. He was booked to play the Star Club in Hamburg, Germany, a gritty, violent venue situated in the heart of the red light district. His opening act was a rough, unknown, leather-clad British quartet calling themselves the Beatles. The dynamic backstage was not one of equals. It was a master class. John Lennon and Paul McCartney worshipped Richard. McCartney, in particular, studied him like a sacred text. He stood in the wings every single night, meticulously dissecting Richard's vocal technique, desperately trying to emulate that trademark, ragged falsetto scream. He absorbed Richard's stagecraft, his dynamic pacing, his entire philosophy of performance. When you listen to early Beatles hits like I'm Down or their blistering cover of Long Tall Sally, you are not just hearing British rock. You are hearing the direct, unfiltered transmission of Little Richard's architectural blueprint. The British invasion of 1964, which fundamentally changed the trajectory of global culture, was essentially the second generation of rock and roll, built entirely on the foundations laid by the Black American pioneers. The Rolling Stones modeled their rebellious sneer on Muddy Waters and Chuck Berry. The Beatles modeled their euphoric, screaming energy on Little Richard. But the devastating irony of this international triumph was that it simply replicated the original cultural theft on a global scale. The British bands readily and honestly acknowledged their debt to Richard, praising him in interviews and demanding that he share the bill on their tours. They respected him deeply, but respect does not pay royalties. Respect does not rewrite the racial hierarchy of the global economy. When the Beatles played to screaming millions at Shea Stadium, generating unprecedented wealth and cultural power, Little Richard was still struggling to secure a fair recording contract. He was forced to watch yet again as a group of white men, this time from across the ocean, took his sound, his vocal stylings, and his energy, and conquered the world with it. He was the perpetual teacher whose students always surpassed him in wealth and status simply because they possessed the correct skin color to be universally accepted by the establishment. As the 1960s bled into the 1970s, the cultural landscape shifted violently. The Civil Rights Movement, the Vietnam War, and the counterculture revolution dismantled the polite, rigid society of the 1950s. Rock music evolved into a serious, album-oriented art form. Artists like Jimi Hendrix, who had briefly played guitar in Richard's backing band and openly stole his flamboyant sartorial style, were pushing the boundaries of sound and political expression. In this new, liberated era, one might assume that Little Richard could finally shed the clown armor. One might assume that a society that now embraced the wild, the queer, and the rebellious would finally allow him to step forward as a serious, multifaceted artist. But the industry is a cruel and unforgiving machine, and it had already locked Little Richard in a cage of his own past. When he attempted to record serious, contemporary soul and funk records, the labels balked. The radio programmers refused to play them. The establishment had made their decision decades ago. Little Richard was a 1950s nostalgia act. He was a human jukebox, permitted only to perform his golden hits in the exact same manic, sequined, heavily made-up style that he had invented to survive Jim Crow. He was trapped on the oldies circuit, forced to play the same auditoriums and state fairs, recreating a heavily sanitized version of a rebellion he had bled for 20 years of her. The armor that had once saved his life had calcified into a prison. He was forced to watch bands like Led Zeppelin and Queen fill massive arenas, adopting his androgynous glamour, his heavy makeup, and his piercing screams, while being hailed as pioneering geniuses. Meanwhile, the actual pioneer was relegated to the status of a living museum exhibit, trotted out to make audiences feel a safe, warm nostalgia for an era that, for him, was defined by terror and exploitation. This persistent, agonizing marginalization bred a deep, righteous, and highly vocal resentment within him. Little Richard did not go quietly into the twilight of his career. As he aged, the polite veneer of the grateful entertainer began to crack, revealing the furious, prosecuting intellect beneath. The issue was no longer about seeking permission. It was about demanding historical restitution. Throughout the 1980s and 1990s, during the interviews on late-night talk shows and at award ceremonies, he staged a relentless, one-man campaign to correct the historical record. He refused to be humble. He refused to play the role of the gracious, forgotten, elder statesman. When interviewers attempted to steer the conversation toward the achievements of Elvis Presley or the Beatles, Richard would abruptly cut them off. He would lean into the camera, his eyes wide and burning with decades of suppressed rage, and deliver his verdict. I am the king. I am the architect of rock and roll. I am the originator. I did it first. These outbursts were often met with uncomfortable laughter from the studio audiences. They thought it was part of the act. They thought the old clown was just doing his routine, but it was not an act. It was the frantic, desperate plea of a man who realized that if he did not forcefully assert his own historical supremacy, the white establishment would simply write him out of the textbooks entirely. He knew that the system prefers its black pioneers to be either silent, humble, or dead. He refused to be any of the three. He was actively prosecuting the music industry on live television, pointing a direct finger at the cultural theft that had defined his life. He was demanding that the world look past the pancake makeup, past the campy giggles, and acknowledge the brutal, undeniable truth that the multi-billion-dollar empire of modern popular music was built directly upon the exploited labor, the stolen genius, and the psychological mutilation of a queer black man from Georgia. When the industry finally capitulated and began to bestow him with lifetime achievement awards and inductions into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, the gestures felt hollow, arriving decades too late to undo the financial and emotional damage. They were placing a crown on a head that was already deeply scarred by the battles fought to forge it. They celebrated his influence, but they rarely acknowledged the agony of his survival. They applauded his flamboyant style, but they intentionally ignored the terrifying political reality that necessitated it. The tragedy of Little Richard is not that he was forgotten. It is that he was selectively remembered. He was remembered as a wild, energetic performer, but deliberately obscured as a victim of a systemic, racial, and sexual hostage situation. As we stand at the end of this investigation, looking back at the smoking crater he left in the cultural landscape, the paradox of the painted monarch finally resolves into a clear, devastating truth. The survival strategy was indistinguishable from the art itself. Little Richard took the trauma of rejection, the terror of racial violence, and the crushing weight of systemic bigotry, and he compressed them into a diamond of pure, kinetic energy. He allowed himself to be robbed of his royalties so that his rhythm could infect the world. He allowed himself to be perceived as a clown so that his voice could shatter the silence. He compromised his own dignity to purchase the future of music. The issue is not just that the music was stolen. The issue is that the theft was the very mechanism by which the world was changed. Rock and roll was not a gentle, organic evolution of sound. It was a violent jailbreak, masterminded by a man who had to dress in drag to sneak past the guards. Little Richard was the sacrificial lamb of the modern era. He threw his own body onto the barbed wire of 1950s America so that every generation that followed could walk freely into the kingdom he built. He was the sovereign, the architect, and the shackled king, and the debt owed to him by the world is one that can never and will never be fully repaid.